1232 in interference.
So sorry.
The previous presenter offered a disclaimer that he was more of a from the biology end rather than the computer, and I'm more from the computer and physics end, but I'm going to be presenting some biological results for an application that was done in my group, so I'll try not to mess those up too badly. But I work at North Carolina State University, and my group focuses on ab initio electronic structure calculations using first principles, so quantum mechanical calculations. And if you know anything about these, you know they're computationally really expensive. They're very accurate, but the work typically scales as the cube or more of the system size, so we can use up almost any amount of computer power you can imagine when we start looking at bigger systems, where big here is defined as a few hundred to a few thousand atoms. And the particular code that we use is called RMG, and it uses real space grids, represents quantities of physical interest, such as electronic charge density and ionic potentials on grids in space. We use a multi-grid method to precondition and accelerate our solutions. And adapting this code to take full advantage of the machines like Blue Waters has been a challenge. We've had some good success and developed some reasonable scalability. We've used some hybrid and threaded models, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. Obviously, GPUs are a big issue. And part of our work has been taking the stuff that we've developed for internal use and putting it into a library that the NSF is providing us resources to open source and make available under a license that anyone can use. And I'll go into that in some more detail. And finally, the application is electron transport in DNA, and there's puzzling experimental results, and we were investigating why these results were puzzling and looking at them from a computational perspective. And my collaborators, the PI with Jerzy Bernholc, and other work, Wenchang Liu, Beacon Tan, Yan Li, and Miroslav Hodak. Okay. Let's do it this way. Okay, so go over this really quickly. I said in RMG we solve density functional equations, which are basically a Schrodinger-like equation, and we use multigrid, and that has properties where you work on one length scale at a time, so you can remove some of the instabilities associated with having very widely divergent length scales in the same problem. And a lot of electronic structure work is done with plane waves, and those methods work really well, but FFTs don't scale very well on machines like Blue Waters. So we get around that with this real space approach. The grids in question are decomposed over the nodes. So each region of space maps to a particular node, and you only really, most of your communication goes between nearest neighbor nodes, which is a plus. We use finite differencing, and there's a lot of different finite differencing schemes. Some of them have longer spatial extent. We use something heavily called Meerstallen, which applies operators to both sides of the equation, gives you a higher level of accuracy, but very short range operators, which is a win again on this type of machine. And this is an example of the type of scaling we have over there. Yeah. Here's an example going out to 8,712 nodes with strong scaling. And you see we start to get some tail off at this point, but it's reasonable up to there. All right, so as we've tried to scale out and take advantages of machines like Blue Waters, we've run into this issue, which I'm sure everybody has, that the core counts have just exploded in the last few years. And Whereas we used to have one socket, one core per node, now we have 32 cores per node. And so if you're trying to use thousands of nodes, the number of MPI processes that you have is really large. And you run into scalability problems for two reasons. One is that the specification itself has problems with scaling out to hundreds of thousands of nodes. And then there's the implementations, which simply may not efficiently implement algorithms that can scale out to that level. Oops. Well, that's where I was going next. Must have hit it. So we've adopted a hybrid approach to try to improve our scalability and use one MPI process per node rather than one per core. So that means you have to have some other parallelization strategy within a node. And we've been using shared memory threads, and different ways you can use these. There's okay. This is going a little too fast here.
It was jumping for me too.
Okay. Okay, so libraries are the simplest way, and like the scilib is threaded, and you can make good use of that, and it's the simplest way to do it. You can do explicit threading, which has worked out in some of our cases has been the best way, or OpenMP. Now, pretty much, you have one MPI process down in threads, okay, applied to each core. So in our case, we have large numbers of electronic orbitals that we're trying to operate on, and we can operate on these independently. So that's a good breakdown. The number of orbitals is typically much larger than the number of cores per node. So we assign a core to an orbital, and we can process them. And we could do this independently, but because of some issues with MPI and threading, it's more efficient for us to process them in blocks. And this gives us a couple of advantages. And one of them is that we can combine communications from multiple cores into a single MPI communication instead of running every single core trying to do its communication separately across or out of the node. Okay. And that's the scaling diagram I showed earlier and some results. This problem was a gas phase amyloid beta protein. Amyloid beta proteins play some role in Alzheimer's disease. And it's a pretty large calculation for a quantum calculation. This particular run, 8,712 GPUs, 139,392 CPU cores. And as I showed earlier, reasonable scaling with some tail off at the high end. So, GPUs are a big win for us, but actually getting them or realizing the promise of GPUs took quite a bit of work. The programming models are very different, which you've all probably run into. Lousy single thread performance on a GPU. It's good for very wide parallel type problems. And we have things that have to run on a CPU if we want decent performance, and things that run well on a GPU. So you have to transfer the data, and with the current generation of GPUs, the data transfer is a bottleneck because it runs over a PCI bus, which is about order of magnitude or two less than main memory speeds. It keeps jumping ahead of me, so I apologize for that. So we had to focus a lot on hiding the latency of the data transfers. I have written some CUDA code. I don't recommend it if you can avoid it. There are very good vendor-supplied libraries for certain things, and that's the way to go if you can. All right. Now, an example of some of our performance improvements for small systems and large systems. Small systems, the speed up is not so, 1.53. It's okay, but not super large. For a large case, we got a tripling of performance between these two. And you notice here, same number of nodes, okay, but we went from 92,922 octron cores to only 46,000 octron cores, but added in the GPUs, got a tripling of performance, which we were pretty pleased with. And actual performance was over a petaflop on Blue Waters on 3,872 nodes. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, we're getting some support from NSF to take parts of our code, well, eventually the whole code, but we're starting out with parts of it, and make them available under an open source license. And this is functionally complete. So we have a library of C++ routines that let you do various tasks, decompose your grids, threading on a node, the finite difference operators, optimize finite difference operators, and communications. Finite differencing, you have to do the nearest neighbor communications. So we have asynchronous communications routines that can operate on blocks, because as I mentioned before, we're using blocks of orbitals at a time. And recursive multi-grid solver with support routines, so that you can write 20 lines of code and have a Poisson solver or a Helmholtz solver that runs on 100,000 cores. And eventually want to have Python bindings for the library so that it'd be easy to pull things together very quickly with Python and write some applications. And as I said, it's functionally complete. The documentation still needs to get done, and the Python bindings are not done. Now, we support fully templated C++, so it supports float, double, and complex, and should run on all of those platforms, and should be released within a few months, sometime in the second half of 2014. All right, so for an example application, there's DNA electron transport, and this is of interest for biological sensors, for DNA sequencing devices, for DNA repair. And I don't know if I'm doing something, or is it just, it's skipping? Anybody else? No.
Maybe the PowerPoint thing's selected, advance on mouse click or after 5 seconds or something.
Oh, after. Okay.
Just like save the PowerPoint is on.
Okay, what's it say? Trying to find where the... Oh well, I'll just have to try to keep it on point. All right, let me get back to where I was. So the experimental results for DNA electron transport are all over the place. And when we say all over the place, not just by a little bit, but I mean orders of magnitude difference between different measurements. So there's a question of what is the reason for this? And, possible reasons, okay, how you link to the DNA strands, the type of counter ions, solvent, is it dry DNA or is it solvated in water? The conformation and sequence, DNA is very flexible, so it can be bent or twisted in various ways. How does that affect the electron transport properties? So we wanted to look at these computationally to try to narrow down what was the largest effect. So probably skip over this fairly quickly. You're all familiar with DNA with basic structure and type of calculations. Now, full quantum calculations on DNA, molecular dynamics calculations, are going to be really, really expensive. So the approach was to do classical MD simulations, done with NAMD, for a variety of setups, and then take a look at snapshots quantum mechanically. So NAMD can do a pretty good job of giving you an idea of the trajectories of the ions, but it doesn't give you any information on the electron transport. So you would take a snapshot of your ionic positions and then do quantum calculations to get the electron transport properties. And you can also vary the amount of solvent around the DNA molecule and do various other things quantum mechanically at a higher level of precision. So we used order-n calculations. These are based off of RMG, the same basic code, and non-equilibrium Green's function method to calculate the transmission. And you can see the different snapshots, number of base pairs, and the current. So you see that the conductivity or the transport is varying by quite a bit, which is in agreement with what you would see experimentally. Now, is what the mechanisms were. All right. The counter ions didn't have a big effect. Okay. Go on to the next one. The solidation didn't have a big effect. And when you say, okay, changes by a factor of 4 or by a factor of 2, well, that's actually not a big effect when you're talking, we're seeing multiple orders of magnitude changes. So yes, they're important, but the biggest effect is something else. And looking through all the different things and the different runs, and it appears that the largest effect on the electron transport is basically caused by the conformation. So how are the DNA molecules distorted? And there is an effect from the sequencing as well, but the largest effect that we saw was from the conformation. So in summary, we've written our code to improve our scalability and performance, and we're going to be releasing the code in open source libraries that will be useful hopefully for other codes besides ours. And this is just one of many applications, and if you have detailed questions on that, I'll probably refer you to someone else in my group who can answer those better than I, but I will do the best I can. Thank you.